How to secure your cloud environment. So cloud services, are somewhat essential or very essential for modern businesses. It can provide cost savings. I do a lot of stuff around FinOps and kind of creating dashboards. GCP is great for that. Having cloud security or implementing it from a top level also allows more room for scalability and also convenience. What I've noticed, however, is that with the increasing use of cloud services comes a bit more need to take on more steps to secure them and also a bit more implementation of security. So, working in teams, I like to hire engineers or what we call T engineers. So, I think at the moment tech roles can be somewhat very siloed. You can have like a Terraform engineer and then you can have a AWS engineer. I think involving teams and kind of creating a culture where we implement the concept of security and having the ability to work with other security teams can be very beneficial in not necessarily implementing cloud security, but also implementing it in part of the process and adding it as a culture. Cloud security shouldn't be something that's separate, it should also be something that's somewhat of a first thought. So in this presentation, we will somewhat discuss how to secure cloud services. I'm going to be talking to how to secure cloud services for Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud Platform and Microsoft Azure, and also some of my horror stories in doing that. So hopefully I can make you laugh. Right, so what are the actual benefits of cloud services? I decided to start with highlighting the benefits of cloud services because being in the cloud and using cloud services has many advantages apart from the pose of security risk. Apart from it being highly scalable, apart from it being cost efficient, you can actually go through the process of adding new users and services more so at a fraction of the cost of traditional IT solutions. And coming from somebody who had a lot of my career working for managed service providers, working in the cloud is somewhat of a dream come true. Also, cloud services are a bit more reliable, and in the world that we're working in where we are remote first, they're always backed up and data is rarely lost. I used to work for a company called M3, and this was in 2015, and it was back in the day when people were like, "What is the cloud? Is it a thing in the cloud?" And I was like, "No, it's just a data center in Ireland." But hey, I was kind of mostly walking SME businesses alongside the journey of migrating from disk, tapes, and backups, and I noticed that the concept of the cloud was somewhat alien to a lot of organizations. But for a lot of organizations that maybe have legacy applications, such as banks or other finances, I always used to implement or help them understand the concept of implementing the cloud, because one of the first reasons would be, why should we switch to the cloud? And usually people just focus on the financing and the cost savings and the aspects of you can kind of have more remote users. But when you actually think of the reliability of the cloud and the security that it gives, especially against disk and tapes, it just basically was a no-brainer. So it's really cool to see from my experiences 2015 up until now, as in how many companies are actually implementing and understanding the importance of cloud services, especially in environments that are somewhat legacy. Right, governance and compliance in the cloud. So from my personal experience, all major cloud providers, AWS, Azure, GCP, we can debate, maybe Oracle could be a major one, but I'm not going to get into that, have somewhat joined all well-known accreditation programs. And that is stuff like PDS2, HIPAA, and of course GDPR. However, from my findings, I've noticed that, apart from cloud being something that we use technically in the company, it's also the responsibilities of the customers to somewhat comply with our data processes and workloads. And it's very hard to do this without having tools that enable a level of continuous compliance checks and real-time alerts and misconfigurations. So what I tend to do within my role is not necessarily highlight the importance of cloud security, but what tools do we have in place as an organization that help enhance using cloud security? Going into cost savings and FinOps, how do we also help enforce this? And most importantly, how do we highlight the concept of security within our organizations? How do we pair with other, not other companies, but other organizations within our company to say, hey, let's work with the audit team, let's work with the finance team. Cloud security isn't just a tech issue, it's a company issue that we all kind of need to join in on, right? So, with looking at the kind of tooling that we can use to help enhance this, the prospects of real-time alerts, the integration of using, working with other teams such as vulnerability pen testing, and also looking at the audit process. What exactly is cloud security? How do we implement it? And what processes do we go in place? So what has been really cool for me is maybe looking at the audit teams and processes and looking at how we handle stuff in regards to GDPR, looking at the amount of data breaches we have and we don't, and saying, how can we somewhat replicate these processes, implement it into our tools, and just add it within the cloud space? So it's something that is still kind of within its inception, but I think, being in the cloud and enhancing cloud security is somewhat of a shared responsibility. So this is the annoying part, right? The steps to secure cloud services. So I've spoken and I've done many workshops when I have my new clients about, I'm designing this architecture piece, jargon words such as we're designing the landing zone, but let's flip it on its head and let's start from a top-down level. It's very easy when working in cloud, and maybe from my perspective, design architectures, to just design the architectures. But it's more so for me designing the architecture with something like a break glass, so that if our cloud service was to be kind of compromised, how would we handle that? So what I like to do is kind of do a workshop and advocate for the culture and what steps can we have to secure the cloud services. So one, use a secure cloud provider. So most of the cloud providers that we have at the moment is somewhat secure. AWS is secure, GCP is secure, and Azure is secure. But it's not just about picking a cloud provider, it's about picking the cloud provider that fits your environment. So for instance, if you are an MSP and you have quite a lot of legacy stuff, and we are on a migration project to do a lift and shift, and you have a lot of applications in Microsoft Office 365, it probably would be best to go to Azure, for instance. If you have quite a lot of data and you work with quite closely with machine learning, probably would be good to go to GCP. So it's ensuring that when you implement these processes, that the cloud provider you use is secure and has strong security protocols in place. What does those security protocols mean for you? So it's involving other team members within the organizations, speaking to other senior stakeholders, just to make sure that we are not just implementing a cloud platform, we are encouraging a culture where we believe that security is our responsibility as well. 2, implementation of user authentication. So, when I used to work in support, I used to work quite closely with Active Directory. So, for instance, as your Active Directory, cloud security and breaching doesn't have to be only concentrated on the external threats. It's also the internal threats as well. So looking at identity access management, role-based access, and how we can kind of implement controls to restrict access to sensitive data. 3, encryption of data. How do we use encryption to protect data from unauthorized access? That can be whitelisting, externally or internally looking at different role-based identity access management tools as well. And number 4, monitoring of suspicious activity. Monitoring for suspicious activity can be implemented by increasing the knowledge of what kind of tools we can have to kind of monitor these alerts as well. Next slide. So I'm just going to go through a lot of the best practices that I've used when implementing security for this cloud. I didn't add Oracle, so sorry for the Oracle fanatics. I've just concentrated on AWS, GCP, and Azure. I'll start with AWS. Right, so I know it seems pretty simple to some, but you'll be surprised at quite a lot of organizations don't really understand or implementing multi-factor authentication. When kind of working and kind of like designing my architecture and designing migration projects, I ensure that all user accounts have MFA, as well as going back to role-based management, identity access management, and kind of curating privileged accounts. This just simply protects against unauthorized access. Like again, the use of identity access management roles. I know it just seems something that's there just to create users, but if we actually look into the roles that people play within the company, it's just to ensure that the exact permissions for a given service is delegated for a given user. This actually can be quite hard to delegate when you're working on small projects, And when working on bigger projects or in bigger organisations, a lot of role-based users can get lost. So it's kind of like going through maybe automated leavers and joiners processes, ensuring that when somebody joins, they have the right access, and making sure that when somebody leaves, they don't have that level of access anymore. So also ensuring that users only have access to the resources that they actually need, which can somewhat be a tedious task, but with the help of first-line support analysts, they can also kind of take part in this. Enable CloudTech, right? So CloudTech is really good as a monitoring tool. It's simply just a login service. It records all API calls made into the AWS account. So essentially, this can enable auditing and monitor activity and suspect suspicious activity. What my company actually has done in the past is kind of looking at the CloudTrail logs, looking at the logs monthly, and also going to the auditing team just to make sure that everything's clean. Security groups, right? So security groups, use that to control your inbound and outbound network traffic, especially when deploying to network or AWS resources. The good thing about security groups, from my personal experience, is that it can also be used to limit access to specific ports, IP, and services. This poses less external threats and kind of goes on to what I was saying about whitelisting. And encrypting data at rest and in transit. I've worked doing this before, and not a lot of engineers that I've worked with have maybe understood the concept of this. But I found it really important to implement this in kind of like my workshops when talking about implementing cloud security, especially when a new migration workshop. It's because the encryption protects the data, but it protects the data that is stored in Amazon S3, Amazon RDS, and all the other Amazon services. And last but not least, monitor network activity. Sounds pretty simple, but monitoring your VP, subnets, and network traffic for unusual suspicious activity can save a lot of heartbreak in the future. And it's not just monitoring this network activity, it's actually going through the proactive approach of monitoring this, downloading the logs if needed be, and actually just making sure that there hasn't been any breaches and kind of pulling it up if there has been. Best practices for GCP. GCP can be pretty similar. It's also enabling a two-factor authentication for all GCP accounts. This just prevents unauthorized access. I know it seems pretty simple, but the use of strong passwords for GCP account, rotate them regularly. I know it seems silly to mention, but quite a lot of people have silly passwords and they don't rotate them regularly, so nobody should be able to guess your passwords. Identity and access management as well can be used to grant access to users on an as-on-needed basis. The monitoring of GCP resources and setup for alerts and suspicious activity is actually my favourite. I think when you're kind of monitoring GCP resources, GCP has a really good dashboard and aesthetic setup, so it can just be a bit more visual, and yet again you can kind of download the logs for that. Encryption to protect data in transit and rest, they have those facilities, and enablement of logging and monitoring to detect and respond to security incidents. Best practices for Azure. Right? Pretty much the same, enabling MFA for all users and administrators, but talking about Azure, and maybe I'm just a bit more biased because this is the first cloud that I clouded on. I think it was more so looking at, I think Azure's Active Directory process is a bit more smoother for me, and I really kind of like draw down on RBAC, mostly to kind of like restrict access to resources. I think the use of NSGs and Azure within the network is really good as well in regards to controlling traffic. And I think the best thing about Azure, especially when it comes to security, is of course the Azure Security Center. That is mostly used to monitor for threats and vulnerabilities, and yet again, this can be something that can be highlighted visually. Azure also facilitates the backup of critical data and applications. The use of Azure Key Vault for the secure storage of secrets and certificates as well. Configure logging and auditing for all resources is highly important, And most importantly, something that I didn't mention with the other clouds is hardening the configuration of all the resources. It's kind of like putting an ironclad on everything. The deployment of intrusion detection system as well, like the word says, it seems a bit more intrusive, but it can also highly protect your environment. And of course, WAF, using a web application firewall just to protect any applications. So to kind of conclude the security pros and cons and risks of kind of using different clouds, like I said, cloud security is somewhat of a shared responsibility. It isn't just about protecting the cloud internally, it's about protecting the cloud from external resources, of course, but also just not siloing the responsibility of clouds to the tech team. It's also encouraging the culture and bringing in maybe the audit team, the finance team, and the pen testing team. It's just, I would say cloud security is encouraging a culture where we brush upon our, etiquette. So, for instance, personal information, it could appear to somewhat be harmless, but if the wrong person gets a hold of it, things can break loose. So, just ensuring that your identity somewhat is never exposed. Making sure that you don't have simple passwords such as your birth date or your mother's maiden name, which can be somewhat frequently used. Of course, never give somebody any other personal information about where you live. Don't store too much of sensitive data. Sensitive data is quite a tricky one because if we are going along the journey of enhancing cloud security, then we can ask, have we not necessarily built a scalable environment yet or ecosystem where we can store sensitive data in the cloud? I would say yes, depending on how robust your cloud environment's in. But more so just think about what you are actually storing in there and if they can be stored in any other way. So some of the cloud considerations that I've gathered from my kind of personal work experience. If you want to achieve cloud security, it's more so of a culture change, but I think the aim should be to achieve enterprise-grade cloud workload protection, just to ensure that we have protection from breaches, data leaks, and most importantly, targeted attacks within our cloud environment. The use of additional third-party solutions are definitely required, but cloud services such as AWS, Azure, and GCP, they're all quite good and they offer a number of cloud-native security features that can be used. It's concentrating for me on centralized visibility, enhancing the policy-based granular control that is somewhat necessary to require, just to make sure that we can provide industry best practices and can be provided by an integrated cloud-native third-party and security stack. If you want to kind of really drill down into granularity, we can look at policy-based identity access management and authentication. We can look at this across diverse infrastructures, and most importantly, just work with groups and roles rather than people at an individual identity access management level and facilitate the updates of identity access definitions. Mostly we can do this in regards to shifting and changing business requirements. It's simple things such as ensuring that if we are going to grant access and privileges to API and assets, that these changes are somewhat absolutely necessary and it's necessary for a group or role, most importantly, to complete its task. Even though it can somewhat seem quite tedious, I think especially when now people are working remotely in different places, ensuring that we have a clean process and we have levels of authentication and higher, the more extensive the privileges, the better. And like I said, it's all about encouraging a culture, good identity access management hygiene, enforcement of robust password policies, and permission timeouts. These things shouldn't be overlooked. And then we can go on to controls for zero trust environments. These can be security across logically isolated networks and have different levels of microsegments kind of deployed. We can deploy this to business critical resources and applications and ensuring that they are logically situated in isolated sections of the cloud. It's kind of going back into granularity apart from identity access management and looking at the security policies that we have around subnet gateways, micro-segment workflows, and in subnets. I think the real goalpost here to really enhance cloud security, especially from an architecture point of view, is to have some sort of a hybrid architecture or make room for hybrid architectures and not necessarily just focus on having architectures or cloud environments that depend on one thing. That can kind of lead to customization of virtual devices. We would have to more so look into virtual networks and their gateways, and making sure that whilst we kind of produce highly enterprise scalable environments, that we also use user-defined routing configurations and dedicated WAN lists. Like I said, when it comes to cloud security, it's more sort of culture. It's something that's changing every day, something that I really enjoy doing. Thank you for coming to my talk, and I hope you made lots of notes.